by number 173970.
All right, and for defense?
Good morning, Your Honor. Chris Weinmiller for Ms. Brophy. Weinmiller is Winemiller, and my bar number is 863177.
All right, and is there anything that we need?
Whoops, Ms. Maxfield.
I'm sorry, Ms. Maxfield,
That's
go
okay.
ahead.
Forget her.
Today could be my day where I'm invisible. That would work probably for me. My bar number is 844337. My last name is spelled Maxfield, and I'm here with Nancy Crampton Brophy.
All right, is there anything to put on the record before we call for the jury?
I think we just make sure that the court is aware that we are going to be requesting a 104 hearing for defense expert Dr. Warford.
All right, and where in the anticipated testimony today does she fall?
I think she's going to be testifying second this morning.
Okay, is that right?
We've got one short witness before her, somebody who spilled over from yesterday.
Okay. And just so I know, we don't have to get into a lot of discussion about it right now, but I have no idea what Dr. Warford is being called for. What is the state anticipating a issue with?
Yes, so Dr. Warford provided a report. It's not a traditional psychological evaluation. It's more of a report in response to 3 defense questions. And the questions, and this is why I think we need the 104 hearing. The first question is, in light of available data, how would you describe Nancy Brophy? So we we have a relevance objection to that, but then 2, why I think we need the 104 hearing is that what are Dr. Warford's specific qualifications to be able to comment on essentially what type of person Nancy Brophy is. I'm not really sure what, it sort of interplays with the relevancy objection, but I think we would need to know her qualifications to speak on that, to form an opinion on what type of person Ms. Brophy is. The second question is, were the Brophies, essentially the second question is, were the Brophies in a domestically violent relationship? I think given what we know about Dr. Warford and what her CV explains, she probably is qualified to form that opinion, so we're not really objecting to that. I don't think we need to get into that in a 104 hearing.
Okay.
But then the third question is essentially, how would the trauma impact Ms. Brophy, her memory, and her presentation? This is especially an area where I think that Dr. Warford would need to explain her qualifications to discuss those areas. It's our understanding that she primarily, almost solely, is an expert on domestic violence. And so we would need to understand her actual qualifications to be able to speak on those issues, specifically regarding trauma, memory, and how that affects one's presentation. And the basis for this, Your Honor, I know we're not going to get too far into it, but the basis for this really is this report. This report in her explanation as to specifically question 3. She doesn't provide any citations, any sort of clinical data. It's really just her kind of talking about stuff and then forming this opinion that Ms. Brophy's memory might have been affected to some degree. So there's really nothing to lead us to believe that she's actually qualified as an expert in that particular field.
Okay. All right. And who is the first defense witness going to be?
Shannon Greenlake.
Shannon Greenlick. All right. Okay, so we will call for the jury then. That sounds good. Did. And I know it was said while we were off record, but defense, can you state the name of the next witness again?
Shayna Greenlake.
All right. So Miss Greenlick, is she still here?
I think so.
Okay.
Yes, there she is.
All right, if you want to come up here into this witness box. We'll have you just step up into this area by the computer monitor and stay standing for just a minute while my clerk gives you an oath.
I'll have you step up just a little bit closer. You can move that chair if you need to. Thank you.
Perfect.
Could I have you raise your right hand, please? Under the penalty of perjury, do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give in this case will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Okay, then you may be seated and you may remove your mask. And then because we're being recorded, I'll just ask you to please state and spell your first and last name.
Shayna Greenlick, SHANA-GREENLICK.
All right, and Miss Greenlick, there is water there if you want any. You don't, it's up to you. But whenever defense is ready.
Thank you. Would you like to get some water?
I'm okay, thank you.
Okay. What do you do for a living?
I'm a product designer
Okay.
for a juice company.
All right. And do you have some training and some experience also in the culinary field? I mean, actually working to produce food?
I do.
Do you know Nancy Brophy?
I do.
When did you last see her?
Approximately 3 years ago or so.
Okay. What was the occasion?
I had gone to the memorial that was at a farm, and I wasn't able to stay for very long, and so Nancy invited me over to her house the next day so that we could catch up.
All right. And was that memorial for Dan Brophy?
It was.
All right. So this would have been shortly following his death?
It was in August, and so his death in June, so
Right. So we're talking about 2018.
yes.
Great. And so you went over to her home and you were visiting with her there? Okay.
With my kids.
Right. And were the two of you reminiscing about things that you'd experienced together with Dan Brophy?
Yes, and we also we did talk about Dan and his and about me and what I had been doing with my life. And
So let me ask you this. When had you met Dan Brophy and Nancy Brophy? Did you meet them about the same time?
I met Nancy first. Nancy was the caterer at my synagogue at Temple Beth Israel, and I think that, well, I got to know her through events that were there. My mother and she talked often. And then when I graduated from high school, I started working at the catering company.
Oh, so you were still young when you met them? Or her?
Yes, definitely young. It was approximately 1995.
All right. And when did you meet Dan Brophy?
After I started working at the catering company, he would come in and work events that were on the smaller side.
Okay, so when you say the catering company, are you talking about the one that Nancy Brophy owned?
Chef de jour.
All right, all right.
Chef de jour. It was out of the synagogue that I grew up in.
All right. So then Dan Brophy would come in to assist with the same catering events?
Yeah. She had a team of chefs, but he would, like they would do a Saturday event together that was like smaller. They would do together, and I did a lot of dishes.
Okay. What kind of relationship did you develop with Dan Brophy?
It was definitely a mentor-mentee sort of relationship with both Dan and Nancy. Nancy really taught me how to be a good worker, what it was like to work hard, and both she and Dan were hard workers. And it was just a pleasure to be with them. Very generous with all of their knowledge. They just wanted to share their knowledge with everybody. With Nancy, she mainly took care of the front of the house, although she really did had her hand in everything because it was her company. But there was definitely a formula for that that was very beneficial for me to kind of learn how to put things together. And
With both of them, you would describe it as a mentoring relationship.
definitely,
Okay.
definitely, definitely mentorship.
Do you consider both of them important to your professional development?
Incredibly important.
What about personally? Did you also develop a personal relationship with them?
I definitely did. Work-life balance was not very, wasn't really a thing then. So I would spend time with both Nancy and Dan together and with them by themselves. And it was just a huge education for me to explore, different foods and different, outlooks on life, really. It was very mind opening for me.
And
One of the things,
did they have an impact on your thoughts about marriage?
definitely it did, because they were so incredibly loving. They just were so dedicated to each other, and it was just like so, it touched me so deep. Nancy, when I, at one point, I would spend a lot of time with Dan gardening. He had pea patches around the city because the house that they lived in at the time didn't have a lot of yard space. And so he had pea patches all over the city. One was like, this is where he kept his medicinal herbs, or this was a place where we had the berries at. And so I would go with them or with him, to take care of his gardens or whatever. One time when I was with Nancy, she picked a piece of fresh herb and put it behind her ear and said that one of the best parts about being married to a chef is that you got to use fresh herbs for perfume. And Dan was just like fabulous to me. I mean, he wasn't really a man who was like super like giving you accolades all the time. So when you did something good, that he was really thought something of that. And it made such an impact.
Let me bring you back to that conversation that you then had after he passed, when you were talking with her at her home. What did she tell you about the impact that you had had on the two of them and how they felt about you?
She said that they thought about me often, and I was totally moved by that because I thought about them, and I still do every single day. It was just like they just touched my life like nobody else had ever, beside outside of my family. Just incredibly accepting. And Dan, she said that Dan would, I understood that Dan would be very proud of me for what I had ended up doing, that I wasn't just like, slaving away in the kitchen, that I had, taken his advice of what he had told me, which was, that I should go to college and finish my bachelor's degree, that if he wanted, if I wanted to learn anything culinary, that he would teach me. That there was nothing that I wouldn't have been able to learn, and that really was very important to my career. And, just like his ability to be so generous with his knowledge.
Okay, so she wanted you to know how proud they were of you?
Yeah. And that really was like, I'd always wanted to like go back to them and be like, look at, I did something other than, and so I
Did,
wanted to just let her know that I was there to support her. That if she needed anything, even though we hadn't seen each other for so long, that I was there, and that, if she needed me, I would be there for her.
all right. And did she seem moved by the fact that you would take that time? Did she seem to really appreciate the fact that you were offering her that support?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we spent 3 hours together, and it was like we would just spend together. So much had happened, but it was a just really generous and beautiful conversation.
Good, thank you. I appreciate you coming in today.
Thank you for having me.
examination?
No.
All right, may this witness be excused?
Yes, thank you.
You can step down.
Thank you.
Oh, and did you get your mask? Yes.
Oh,
Okay,
she's
all
got
right.
it in her hand.
All right. And then for the jury, there is a legal matter we have to take up before the next witness. It may take a little bit of time, so we will have you go back into the jury room.
I'll leave the record running, Judge.
Yeah, that's fine.
All rise for the jury.
All right, let's be seated. We'll wait for Ms. Lou to get back so that we can swear the witness in. Oh, she is here, okay. Uh, All right, Dr. Warford, if you want to step into the witness box by the microphone, my clerk will give you an oath.
Have you please raise your right hand? Under the penalty of perjury, do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give in this case will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Okay, then you may be seated and you may remove your mask. And then because we're being recorded, I'll ask you to please state and spell your first and last name.
Patricia Warford. Patricia, Patricia, Warford, Warf as in Frank, ORD.
All right, and before we get started, I think you may have been in here, Dr. Warford, but at this point, we're just going through a portion of what you might testify to so I can see if there's objection to it. Defense, whenever you are ready. And there is water there if you want any.
Oh, wait, thank you.
Your Honor, given one of the concerns that the state offered, I think we probably should go through all of our qualifications, even though this is a 104 hearing.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. Dr. Warford, what is your profession?
I'm a licensed psychologist.
How long have you been licensed as a psychologist?
I've been licensed in Oregon since 1998.
And what about before that? Other states?
Afterwards, I got licensed briefly, relatively briefly, in Washington, but then I got too busy and I didn't keep that license.
Okay, but your initial license was Oregon. Right.
Yes.
What's your current specialty?
Well, currently, since November of 2019, I am only doing forensic work. And predominantly, prior to that, when I was doing clinical work, it was trauma and recovery.
All right. Now, do you also have a specialty in domestic violence?
I did. I wrote my doctoral dissertation on that.
Okay. Is there a close intersection between domestic violence and trauma?
Yes.
Tell us.
Trauma.
I want to come back to that point, but why don't you tell us a little bit more about the clinical practice that you had, the education, sort of what led you up to the point that you became a forensic psychologist?
I started graduate work in 1991. I started working with college students in 1992. In 1993, I had gotten my master's in that spring, so that fall I started working with sexually abused children at Yamhill County Mental Health. I worked there for a year, and then I got hired the summer of 1994 briefly there, but I was doing my internship, and it just got to be too many hours with, I was married and had children, so then I just went and did my doctoral dissertation, my internship at Western Psychological Association, got my degree in 1996, finished my licensure, my residency, and then was licensed in 1998. And then in 1999, I went into private practice, and I stayed there in private practice until November of 2019.
And so tell us about the nature of that practice. Did it vary over that time period?
It did. again, it is as a practitioner, generally we're pretty much generalists. So I worked with, again, children, adults. I didn't do much family work. I did more couple work. I did group work. For 15 years, I did groups with men who were had been mandated for domestic violence interventions. Again, my area of expertise was trauma and recovery, so I worked with a wide variety. Some of it was victims of domestic violence, but I'd also began to work quite a bit with police officers who had been traumatized, say, in a police shooting. I had worked with people who had been on juries that had, hellacious crimes. I had worked with people who had been victims of rape or assaults, those sorts of things, so just a generalist. And so in the course of that,
Do you also have some experience with military people?
I did, less so, but partly because I was raised military, and then my son went into the military. So I have also worked with that population, but less so just because that population tends to go back more into its own,
To the VA?
yes.
All right. So it sounds like there's been a pretty consistent crossover of work with people who've been traumatized in different areas and in different ways. Is that a fair assessment?
I'd say that's a fair assessment, and I'd say that, again, there's lots of other areas where trauma manifests itself. Depression, anxiety can be PTSD, but not always. I didn't work in areas where substance abuse was primary. I usually referred them out to do that as a primary issue. But often there's, again, especially once the adverse childhood experience studies came out of the late 1990s and through the last 20 years, there's a lot of crossover of trauma. And when I first started in graduate school, even though now we think of everything as trauma, or we recognize the role of trauma, when I started in graduate school, it wasn't that way. It was a huge debate about like who would qualify as traumatized. So, for example, in the early 1990s, women who'd been battered could not qualify for a PTSD diagnosis because it had to be an uncommon event, such as war. So a lot of our PTSD understanding, our understanding of trauma, really came out of Vietnam veterans. Prior to that, it was seen as a moral failure rather than perhaps a neurobiological response. And so in the 1990s, there is a growing body of literature which looked at trauma. And then again, how the brain reacts to it, those sorts of things. And that was, again, initially it was theoretical. So for example, Stephen Porges' and that's spelled Porges, polyvagal theory came, and then later neuroscience, MRIs, functional MRIs, those sorts of things showed that in fact that was work. That was the way it was. And so a lot of our understanding of the neurobiology of trauma really has been within the last 20 years, and the acceptance of trauma as an important component really has been only about 10 or 15 years.
All right. All right. Would you like some water? Can I get you
Probably.
some?
Thank you.
Sure. So what I understand from what you've said is that we societally, and the profession in particular, the medical profession, the psychological profession, began to focus on trauma in the aftermath of the Vietnam War because there was such significant fallout, such obvious fallout, and so that became a real field of study at about that time.
Well, I would say that the Vietnam vets gave us, unfortunately, a body of literature, but it was very confined. I mean, we've always had aspects. So in World War I believe we call it shell shock, or battle fatigue, those sorts of things. But in the early 1900s, it was considered a moral failing of this is the term that was used at the time, the lower classes. Now, they didn't really question that. And if somebody of a upper class ended up having battle fatigue or shell shock, it was considered an anomaly. Again, unfortunately, they didn't consider that the upper classes didn't send their boys to war. They sent their boys to the universities, and so they were out of it. So it wasn't until the Vietnam vets, and it was more, and the Pacific Northwest especially, had a contingency that had gone off into the wild spaces. And that was where the work with PTSD initially started. However, it was only looking at war trauma.
Okay.
And
So
then,
let's bring that forward a little bit. It sounds like there was some recognition within the profession and the medical community that trauma was more widespread, and it wasn't just veterans who were experiencing it. And that was coming about in the 70s, the 80s.
well, earlier 80s, Lenore Terror. So within the field, there was this idea that children were resilient, and it really came out of Freud's work. Freud believed that children could not be traumatized, that even children who were reporting sexual abuse were not really sexually abused, but rather that there were fantasies, the Oedipal complex or the Electro complex. So, and that actually held until, at least the 1970s. I have a friend who was trained during that time, and she said that's what she was taught. She was taught there is no such, that sexual abuse is just a fantasy of the child, not reality. Of course, now we know that's not true. And then in 1976, there was a kidnapping of a busload of children in Chowchilla, California. And the children were kidnapped. They were buried in a bus or a van underneath a rock quarry. After 72 hours, they found their way out. And there's a meeting with the mamas and the parents, and they're told, because the pathos of the day was, act like nothing happened and your kids will be fine. And so that's what they did. They pretended like nothing happened. And after about 2 years, a couple of the mamas went to a psychiatrist and said, you know what, my kids aren't fine. They're not okay. And Lorna Tier writes about this in her book, Too Scared to Cry. But the psychiatrist was, well, this is what our training says, but there's this woman who suspects that children can be traumatized. And so they then went to Lenore Terror, and Dr. Terror said, well, we'll come in, but we don't have any way of doing therapy, but we'll do research. And so in the late 70s, she began to do research on these children who had been kidnapped and held for 72, or had been missing for 72 hours. And her initial control group was the local, a neighboring community, because during that time, Chowchilla was still a small community. So in the summer, they would bus their kids off to this other community for summer resources. And so that was how they got kidnapped, was in this.
Well, because this is a hearing and not before the jury,
Sorry.
let me move you forward a little bit. What was the outcome of that study?
What she found was that the control group initially, there wasn't a difference between the two groups, but when she divided the control group into healthy kids and kids that came from maybe lower income or their violence within the family, she found significant differences in the rate of substance use or medical conditions with that compared with the kidnapped kids. And so her work comes out in the early 80s. There's not a lot that goes on. It kind of builds momentum, but the real movement then was in 1999. In 1995, Kaiser wanted to know what predicted a heart attack. They sent out a survey. Somebody at the last minute added 10 questions that had to do with childhood trauma. And when they got the surveys back starting in 1999, they sent out 17,000 in San Diego, got 9,000 back. When those surveys started coming back, they found that the number one correlate for an early heart attack was seeing your father beat your mother. And since that, because of those, they threw out all the other questions on that survey and kept those 10. And the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, came in and took over those studies. And since 1999, every year there's been more, like 2 or 3 more of things like substance use, blah, blah,
let
blah.
me
That's
ask
where
you-
trauma then became not just a witness, but a victim.
Okay. So when did the science reach the point that there were objective ways to measure it besides looking statistically at the results of these studies?
Probably about the last 15 years, as we've seen rises in MRIs and functional MRIs and CAT scans. And sorry, there's this wonderful picture where it's neural tracking of the neural pathways. And so what gets lit up when somebody's recalling a traumatic event, those sorts of things.
Okay.
And there's one other one that was done with MRIs, and they found that, again, there's the prefrontal cortex connection to the frontal lobe is weakened with certain types of trauma.
Now, with the advent of that objective ability to view the brain, essentially the brain on trauma, what has been learned about the way different types of trauma affect people, and the similarities or differences between trauma that's caused by war, trauma that's caused by domestic violence, trauma that's caused by being abused as a child, whether that's by a loved, trusted one who's supposed to be taking care of you, or whether it's by a stranger who locks you with a group of your friends in a bus.
Well, the best way, I think, to
How,
just,
how does trauma play out across those different kinds of demographic issues and different sources of trauma?
sure. And I think the best way to describe it is using Dan Siegel's work. He was trained as a adolescent psychiatrist and looked at attachment, but he then now considers himself an interpersonal neurobiologist. So his way of explaining it is that if you think of your arm as our spine, and the palm of our hand as the corpus callosum, this is breathing, blinking. This is our limbic system. The amygdala is the seat of fear and of aggression. Hypothalamus is the seat of meaning. Hippocampus plays a role in cortisol and memory. And then the frontal cortex, the thinking part of our brain, the executive functioning, the adult part of our brain, wraps around it, okay? And then there's, as Stephen Porges, there's a nerve behind our ear that goes to our face, our larynx, and our heart, other parts of our inner organs, but it gets triggered without going through the thinking part of the brain. When we are confronted with a trauma or something that is, a trauma is the best way of saying it, is that Dan Siegel talks about the frontal cortex going offline. And so we're running on automatic pilot. Now, there's certain aspects of that are going to be automatic for all of us, but then there's some nuances that are going to be based on our personality. So, for example, if there is a trauma where our thinking part of our brain kind of shuts down because the limbic system gets ignited within 0.21 milliseconds, incredibly fast. And it takes 0.24 milliseconds for the thinking part of our brain to come on. So when the limbic system gets triggered and escalated, the thinking part of our brain goes offline. And Dan Siegel calls it flipping your lid. And so depending on what our tendencies are, so if our tendencies are to be extremely emotional, then it's going to come out of that. If our tendency is to be more cognitive, but we can't access that part, it is tended to go more flat. So there are certain aspects that are going to be universal, and then there's going to be some that are unique to the individual's training, to their personality, those sorts of things.
Okay. What about, though, one of the things I was trying to get at with that question is, what are the variances or the similarities between different sources of trauma and how those affect people?
There are certain things I think that are universal, different variances. I guess I'm not sure what your question is. I'm thinking in terms of, I had looked at a lot of the research on, say, children of Holocaust survivors, right? And because their parents had gone through such a hellacious experience, often those children said, my parents carried it for the rest of their lives. So those children, in many ways, often became very intent on making sure that the parents made sure that they informed the children to the point not to traumatize them, but to make sure that it never happened again, okay? Flip side, an interesting study was done with the children of the guards in the concentration camps. And after World War II, they had the highest rate of suicides because they couldn't wrap their head around that this daddy who I loved, who was fun and played with me, did these horrible things during the day. And so trauma is going to be, there's certain aspects that are universal, but there's certain aspects that are going to be held differently based on the population, the group. And I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but I'm not sure I'm understanding your question, perhaps.
Okay. Well, what I'm asking you about is what in your training and experience qualifies you to talk about trauma in a variety of settings, not just specific to domestic abuse.
Okay.
Right. You've had a varied clinical practice, so you've had exposure to a number of people with different kinds of traumas. And you've had a particular focus more recently on domestic abuse. But what are the commonalities in how trauma affects not just different individuals, but different sources and types of trauma affect people in general. It is always going to be specific to the individual, and we do understand that. But would working with domestic violence survivors, for instance, give you some insight into and some ability to speak to and address trauma that somebody had experienced because they were an abused child as opposed to an abused spouse, or because they had experienced some sort of really traumatic workplace event?
I actually think it's the reverse. So one of the things is that, as I said, in my graduate school, we didn't look at a lot of trauma. However, we are required to do CEUs. And over the years, I've taken a lot of CEUs. Bessel van de Kolk is one. John Briere is out of UCLA. Bessel van de Kolk out of Boston. I've followed a lot of his research. And so I think it's the reverse. I think there's this global aspect of trauma that we need to understand first. And that those are the things that are more universal. And then we can break it down into, so say abuse of children. Again, it kind of depends on the age group. The research out of the Romanian adoptions we led us to understand about attachment disorders. If the attachment is disrupted, continues to be disrupted after 18 months, we understand about developmental stages and how it gets impaired by trauma. Someone who is an adult who has a relatively stable childhood is going to have a different response to trauma than somebody who's been traumatized their entire life. So I'd say that there's more this understanding of the global aspects of it, and then we break it down into what a particular group. And I had written the book for Crime Victims Academy back in the late 90s, or I think early 2000s. And I had written about trauma bonding. But again, having to understand the brain and the neurobiology was an important piece of that.
Okay. And have you received training specifically in neurobiology and the chemical aspects of trauma and memory?
I've taken CEUs on that, particularly, like I said, Bessel van Gogh does a lot of work on that. Then there's a lot of reading, a lot of books over the years that I looked at that.
Okay. And did most of that come about with the advent of the fMRIs and the ability to actually see these traumatic responses that you were describing?
Yes, yeah, and that especially Bessel van de Kolk's work, and just because that's a complicated name, Bessel is Bessel space Van VAN space a capital KOLK.
And what was the connection between those, the increased interest in neurobiology and the chemistry of the brain, and what was being observed on fMRIs and the other objective tests?
Well, there's certain reactions that you can see people. For example, if you've often have heard people say, "Oh man, he or she turned as white as a sheet." Well, what causes that? Well, what it causes is that polyvagal theory. I mean, that polyvagal nerve is getting prepared for the fight or flight response. And so the blood moves away from the outer extremities the evolutionary perspective is that it's preparing for war, as it were. And it's going to protect the inner organs. There are, the shutting down, the people aren't maybe as quick, or they're giving an automatic response as opposed to a thoughtful, measured response. Or the question became, why is this happening? And then as we had that advent of newer mechanisms to address it or to look at it, and then became the question is, how do we remedy that? And that has also been studied by, for example, Sarah Laser I think she's out of Harvard, in her study on mindfulness and how that then helps the repair. Who else did? Francine Shapiro and her work with EMDR. So there's just different people who then were interested in how do we remedy that? How do we provide interventions that are helpful, are effective?
Okay. And what is some of the training that you've had that's specific to understanding what the actual, I understand that part of what you were just talking about is that in order to remedy it, you have to understand what happened, right?
Yes.
But can you speak specifically to the training and experience in the specific chemistry, the specific response? You started to talk about the vagus nerve. the fight or flight response. But can you go back to that without jumping ahead to remedies immediately to talk a little bit more about what was learned about what was actually causing what was being viewed on the fMRIs and these other objective tests? When you could see that the response to trauma was similar, that there were specific patterns that were showing up on the subjective testing. What was learned about what was causing those patterns and what was being observed, the actual neurobiology, chemical part of the process.
Well, and chemical maybe, more the neural pathways. And so, for example, when they were able to start mapping, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the exact name of it, but basically they can look at the neural pathways as a neural network tracking. And so what we have historically, especially within psychology, thought of is that everything kind of goes from the brain down to the body. Okay, but on my laptop, I've got this wonderful picture where most of the neural pathways go from the body up to the brain. More pathways go from the limbic system to the cognitive piece than the frontal lobe down to the rest of the body. And that they were able to see what parts light up in different people's brains. What are the reactions? And from that, we were able to understand that, oh, okay, so we see the heart rate going up. What do we want to do to get the heart rate down? Things like mindfulness. And actually, in the 1970s, there was a book put out called Mind is Healer, Mind is Slayer. And it looked at why were Buddhist monks able to lower their heart rate so much that they wouldn't bleed out, for example. And so there's some of the sciences that they've known for forever. We just didn't know the pathways for it. And that was then you see the rise and the advent of mindfulness. Cognitive behavioral kind of came in the 60s, but it has some limitations, especially in terms of trauma. Then you see like Marsha Linehan and her work in 1990s with dialectical behavioral therapy. And then again, they've just been able to find, okay, we need to kind of slow things down. Well, if you slow things down, what can you do? Deep breathing is one. Mindfulness is a trauma remedy. So when somebody's traumatized, their frontal lobe is offline. But if we can ask them, if we can have them do deep breathing, slows their bodies down, calms their bodies down, and we begin to ask them questions that forces the frontal lobe to kick in. And so we can calm them down. We can help them make those attachments. We can have them, as I mentioned, EMDR allows them to come from a calm space to talk about trauma. It lowers the response to a traumatic memory without changing the moral code.
So let me back you up again without talking about treatment, going back to traumatic responses. Are you familiar with and have you worked in the area of and studied dissociative states and memory impairments that are related to traumatic events?
Sure, and actually, I've been treating, I did it within the context of domestic violence and battered women, and it's called trauma bonding, and so I've been teaching on that since the mid-1990s. And again, we all go into dissociative states, just to different degrees and at different times. So for example, if you drive the same way to work every day, probably at some point your mind gets distracted and you still have somehow gotten to work without getting in a crash, or you probably stopped at that stop sign, even if you don't remember stopping at that stop sign. And so dissociation is much more common event. It's kind of a mundane, everyday event. And then there are times when it gets connected to the trauma because of, remember I mentioned the hippocampus? Well, the role of the hippocampus is twofold. One is to help wire in memories, but it also has a role in getting cortisol out of our system. So what triggers the flipping our lid, the trauma, is an adrenaline rush. Our adrenal glands are on top of our kidneys, it floods our bodies, and that's not good for our internal organs. And so what happens then is cortisol comes in to get the adrenaline out of our system. Well, cortisol isn't better for our system. So the role that the hippocampus plays is in getting out the cortisol, because cortisol also impedes memory. And so if you and I are in a fight and we're both escalated and we say something to each other in this moment, I'm only going to hear things I hear as a threat. I'm not going to wire anything that isn't a threat because my limbic system is preparing me that there are dangers. And it's not just fight or flight, it's fight, fight, freeze, or faint. Officers, police officers, for example, very much know about freeze, that it's deadly for a police officer. So there are actually 4 responses. Our tendencies are going to kind of determine more what we do. Women are more socialized to faint, to freeze, but we can fight or flight just as men can. Men are more socialized to fight or flee, but they can also freeze. And so that's, sorry, I get distracted, I get caught up in this stuff. Could you bring me back to your question? I apologize.
So I was asking about dissociative states and memory, and specifically how that relates to your work and experience and training
Okay.
with respect to trauma.
Sure.
The
So-
specific relationship between trauma and memory.
Sure. So as I said, if we're in a fight and you say to me, you know what, I don't even want to go to that dinner party on Friday night. Well, that's not really relevant to a dangerous piece for me right now. So it's not going to get wired for me. But you're saying, you know what, Patty, I'm not a threat to you. My brain will actually filter out the word not, because not isn't a threat. I am a threat to you is a threat, right? So my brain will actually wire out what is not a threat, but it will catch words like threat.
So I think what you're describing is a very acute focus.
And then what happens is Friday comes around, I'm getting ready to go to the party, you're not. Because of course you remember what you said, that you're not going to the party on Friday night. I don't, because my focus was so narrow that I didn't get wired in. And you'll say, I told you it. I'll say, no, you didn't. And now we're off to a different fight. So that is what adrenaline does. That's what trauma, but also there's a trauma that it's the adrenaline and the cortisol that impact it.
Okay. So how would you describe in uniquely traumatic events how those kinds of impairments can play out? What's sort of the range of what can happen with respect to memory impairment in an instance that is uniquely traumatic, not just an argument that you have that, maybe you have 1 or 2 arguments a year, but it's something that happens throughout the course of your life. You've got some experience with it, but something that you can't even relate to. It's so outside your experience, and it's so important. You recognize it as something that's going to have such an impact on your life going forward, that it's a true shock.
Sure. Well, first the body attempts to find homeostasis. And then we tend to want to find focus of what makes sense. We're trying to get that frontal cortex back on. And when there is that influx of cortisol and adrenaline and cortisol, the worst time for memory to be accurate is between 20 minutes and 4 hours. Also, for example, as I had mentioned earlier about working with police officers, there's a reason why after a police officer shooting, for example, they don't do an immediate interview, because they recognize that there is this blank spot in the memory that goes on. And so there's it's not a good period. If I'm trying to think of it this way, and you let me have my way of saying that, I may be able to come to a generally, eventually, logical, linear narrative, but probably not. It's probably going to be all like this in those 4 hours. If, however, you're going to be asking me side questions, it's going to redirect, and because I'm respectful, I want to help you, and so my brain is trying to shift to answer those questions, but it may not actually be all there to be able to do that.
Okay. And what has been learned, and what can you speak to with respect to the long-term effect on memory? What you're describing right now is sort of what's happening in the here and now, in the immediate aftermath of this event. But what is known about how that plays out over time?
Well, memory gets wired on different levels. So there's a sensory level. So, for example, when I walked in, whatever is behind me, I saw it, I registered it. But if you were to ask me about it now, I have no idea. Okay? So that's sensory level. It's very quick. Then it goes into short-term memory, and then it goes into long-term memory. And if it gets disrupted in any of those neural pathways, it doesn't go into long-term memory. And then humans tend to, we see this more in, say, people who are long-term alcoholics. They do what's called confabulation because they get blotches in their memory, or they may have had a blackout. And so they reconstruct that memory for what they think it is. And it may not be accurate. Or again, memory is,
Let me stop you there, just so I don't forget to go back to that. Can that happen, when you talk about alcoholics, I tend to think in terms of there being some organic brain damage. Maybe that's not accurate. but-
long-term, certainly. But if we think of the brain, alcohol drugs affect it from the outside in, which is why the last thing to go is breathing, right? But the memory part, the frontal cortex, the thinking, the verbal aspects of it kind of get lost, and then it gets reconstituted in a way that they kind of fill in the blanks. And then, so long-term certainly can. There can actually be a dementia that's based on long-term substance use, and it has to do with absorptions and if we actually get them the right.
Right, but
So-
I'm asking you now about things that wouldn't involve a dementia or organic damage. So I want you to speak to the question without referring to, I mean, you can refer
Right.
to it, but I want you to go
Sure.
beyond that and talk about people who have brains that have not been physically damaged in some way, don't have some sort of chronic long-term physical impairment from something like alcohol, but are really reacting specifically to the stress that we've been talking about, to trauma.
Sure. Well, if it isn't wired into if it doesn't move from the sensory level to the short-term level to the long-term, it's not going to be in the long-term memory.
Okay, and that's universally true.
Sure.
And I think what you're saying is that's something that's known to happen with trauma.
Yes.
Okay. Is it almost exclusively caused by trauma? But if you leave aside the organic impairments, obviously, if somebody, if they're in a horrible auto crash and they suffer brain damage as a result of that, that could happen too, but I'm trying to separate out the two.
Sure. Well, it doesn't have to be organic brain damage, and forgive me for bringing a personal, but it's a good example. On December 1st of 1990, I was going through a intersection in a Ford Escort. A garbage truck was the guy's first day on the job. He didn't see the red light. He was looking for the street lights. He ran through that street light and he broadsided me on my passenger side. Okay. To this day, and again, I don't, because I went to graduate school after that, so I don't think I had brain damage, maybe, but I don't think so. But to this day, I remember going into the intersection. I remember looking at the garbage truck saying, he's not going to stop. I have absolutely no memory of the crash. And the next thing I remember is looking at the light, going, did I run a light, and seeing the light go from yellow to red, and I knew I hadn't. So, but again, everything went so quickly.
But in that instance, you weren't injured.
I wasn't, a few bumps or bruises. I made jokes about being hit by a garbage truck.
And the reason you're offering that is because it was the trauma response, the fear.
It's just, things went so fast. And I think it's shocking, and you just can't quite grab what just happened. And so the things that we typically think of don't get wired. So, and then when there's a trauma, again, we as a society tend to think if I can give you a linear narrative, it's accurate. But the reality is that cortisol and adrenaline makes us focus on what is a danger. And so traumatic memory is more like snapshots out of sequence than a nice linear.
Is there a therapy for that when that happens, when the event is so traumatic that it's caused this disruption, this chemical flood, and then this sort of very, very partial, incomplete set of memories? Has science, has your discipline yet found a way to remedy that?
There's some discussion. I mean, there's some, and I don't come down on the side on this, okay? There are some who say something such as, hypnosis might help. And then there's the others, the neurobiologists, who are saying, no, if it's not wired into the long term, there's no way of retrieving it.
And is the worry there that it would then be confabulation or filling in, that you can create a narrative after
Sure.
the fact, but who knows if it's accurate?
Sure. And Elizabeth Loftus actually did work on creating false narratives of abuse in children. And so we do know from her work that that can happen.
Your Honor, I think we've addressed the issues that the state raised. I would offer her CV, which I think I might have to present electronically. I'm not sure I printed that out.
I have a copy if you'd like.
Oh, I would, thank you.
So,
I think we'll make that difference.
I just want to be sure it was my updated one and not.
let me just ask defense, and then I can turn it over to Mr. Overstreet if he wants to ask questions to assist the objection. But the first of the objections was Dr. Warford's qualifications to comment on what type of a person Ms. Brophy is, and I really haven't heard anything along those lines. I've heard about a lot of experience with trauma and understanding of how trauma affects people's ability to form memories. But I guess I also don't understand what defense would be seeking with regards to the state's first objection.
Oh, I'm sorry, Your Honor. I did overlook that. So I'll just continue with her if it's okay with the court.
It's fine.
Dr. Warford, did we ask you to conduct an evaluation of Ms. Brophy?
You did.
And when did you begin working on that?
June 15th of 2019.
Right. And were you able to conduct, over a period of time, were you able to conduct a number of standardized tests?
Yes.
And did you interview her and also review collateral materials?
Yes.
Did you provide us with a report of the evaluation that you conducted?
Yes.
As a part of conducting those types of evaluations, do you typically try to use those standardized tests and your observations in the evaluation and also the collateral information to get a sense of the personality type of the individual that you're dealing with?
Well, I would say that a thorough assessment is three-pronged. One is we get their history as they tell it, okay? We do psychological testing, and then we get collateral documentation. You all, I believe, call it discovery. Those three prongs have to be consistent with each other for multiple reasons. And then we also look at it within, say, a developmental perspective. What does the research say about, different age groups? And so I looked at all those pieces and put them together: her self-report, her psychological testing, and then what others said about her.
Okay, so what I'm asking is, when you conduct these forensic evaluations, is a key part of what you're trying to determine who you're dealing with, who this person is at baseline?
Yes.
Why is that important?
Well, for one, we have an ethics code that says that if I don't evaluate her, if I haven't met with her, I have an ethical obligation to tell the hero of the fact, or the person, that my findings may not be reliable or valid. So there is that piece in terms of just, if I'm going to present anything about her or him, I have to have met with them. The other is that there are behavioral observations that we make. Some of them we can go to, in terms of insight, we can look and see if somebody is, say, psychotic or even faking psychosis, or not psychotic, and they seem to be good, reliable historians of the fact. We look at their way that they presented within their psych testing. For example, among other things, is, are they giving what's called a positive impression management? Are they trying to look angelic? Or are they doing what's called a negative impression management? Are they trying to look horribly mentally damaged? And then on our test, we have what's called validity scores. So we look at that piece. And then we look, are there psychological conditions which may affect how they're reporting? But again, I think within the forensic setting, the most valuable are the collateral documents. How do people who have seen this person and known them either long-term or outside of the context of my setting, see them and perceive them? Now, the other piece that I think is really important is context. And that's based on the work of Phillips and Bardo out of Stanford, who argues that, again, the context of one's life needs to be understood in order to understand the individual.
Okay. Why is it important to understand the individual?
Because unless we know someone, we can't really understand their reactions to things. So there was a famous case back in I believe it was the 70s or 80s. A young girl was kidnapped. The man who had kidnapped her had a history of kidnapping teenage girls and then murdering them. And in her case, she survived. And so and I wish I could remember the name of the case, but when the FBI were looking, they realized that this girl had a long history of trauma. So her reaction, instead of being panicked or scared, was just kind of flat. And that's what helped her survive. So we can understand someone's reaction within a period or in a moment in time if we understand the macro system, the micro system, and the individual piece. And those three are based on Phillips and Bardo's work, among others.
Okay. So before you would move into a more specific evaluation of someone, would you always start with that sort of trying to establish as a baseline who this person is and how they compare to other people in the population based on these standardized tests and also your ability to observe them, the impressions that you get, and then what you learn from these collateral sources?
No, I always start with the interview. If I have the collateral documentations, I will review those first. Often I will review those first and then later.
That wasn't what I was
I
asking.
know, but you're asking if I start with this. No, I need to know the history so that when I look at the testing, does this testing make sense? Okay, sorry.
What I'm asking you is, do you attempt to assess who the person is at baseline before you move into more specific evaluations of things like domestic violence or response to trauma? When you're trying to look at particular issues that may have some legal significance in the case, do you first need to understand who you're dealing with?
Yes, I guess I'm thrown off by the line of baseline because I think humans are more complex.
But I'm talking about for that person.
Yes, who are they at the core? I mean, again, what do they value? How do they present? Sure.
Okay. And why is that important?
Again, if someone is being dishonest, for example, you're going to find discrepancies between how they try to present with me and the collateral documents and or the testing data. So when there are discrepancies within those 3 points of data, I need to understand why. Are they trying to fool me? Are they trying to, is there a reason why, say, they want to look healthier than perhaps they really are? So in child custody cases, of course they want to look better. Is there a reason they want to look more psychologically damaged than they really are? Guilty except for insane. So we have to understand kind of what is their baseline. Is there a consistency between what they tell us and all the other things? Can this all align in order to get a sense of who they are, not just in terms of veracity, but how they present? What do they emphasize? What is their core beliefs?
Okay. So if you were, for example, then going to try to make an assessment or determination of the presence or absence of domestic violence in a relationship, would it be important to you to also review collateral sources?
Collateral sources, especially in domestic violence, I think is much more important than what the person tells me.
The state agreed at the start that the witness is qualified to discuss whether they were in a domestic violence relationship. At least that was my understanding.
That's correct.
So I don't know that you need to, I'm not trying to shorten what you do,
No,
but,
Your Honor, I wasn't planning to go into it too, but I think in order for her to really explain why one is important, the relationship
Okay.
between that assessment and the other more specific areas she was asked to evaluate is critical.
okay.
So I don't know that I need to ask more to establish that, but that was essentially where I was going with that last question. And I just have. Right. Your Honor, I do have a copy of her vita, and I would like to forward that.
And has the state seen it as well?
We have it, yes.
Okay.
Okay, the last one. 359, okay, got it. Thank you.
What number did we give it?
359.
Okay, all right. We're gonna take a minute, we need to. All right, I have what's been marked as Defense Exhibit 359.
Thank you, Your Honor, and I think those are the questions we have for now.
Okay. Did you have any questions, Mr. Overstreet?
Yes. So Dr. Warford, excuse me, in order to form that opinion about what kind of person or personalities Miss Brophy possesses, you based part of that too on the MMPI too, is that correct?
Yeah, I did initially. The MMPI-2 was initially validated in 1989, and so it is a standard within my field. There are limitations to the MMPI-2, which is why they revised it. And so when I was given an opportunity to give her an MMPI-3, which is more updated and I'd say more valid, I gave her that then as well.
Okay. And I just want to, you have a section here called Profile Validity, where you state that the patterns that you were seeing with Ms. Brophy were denying problems in an extreme manner. An individual who presents this pattern on the MMPI-2 appear to have consciously distorted their response to create the impression that they are extremely moral and virtuous and have no personal shortcomings. Continue to say they describe their essential difficulty in a manner to escape personal blame. Their lack of cooperation with the testing appears to be designed to avoid showing any psychological weakness and to appear responsible and in control of their lives. Is that correct?
Yes, and that would be accurate with the MMPI-2.
And then you stated that you met with Ms. Brophy. That sounds standard in making this sort of determination.
Well, obviously to interview and do the testing,
Sure.
yes.
And then you said you relied on collateral sources.
Yes.
And so obviously with what you're saying in that MMPI-2 is you're saying, well, when you meet with Ms. Brophy, she's not going to necessarily tell you the truth.
Well, again, we've got to make the distinction between the MMPI-2 and the MMPI-3.
Okay.
And so the MMPI-2, as I said, was validated in 1989. There are certain problems with the MMPI-2, predominantly because it was based on actuarial data. And actuarial data, it was not found to be as valid in the later research. There's other aspects in terms of what was called, there are other aspects of the MMPI-2 which were problematic, which is why it was revised. But ethically, once I gave her that instrument, I was bound to then report it.
Sure. And so are you saying that what I just read is inaccurate?
I wouldn't say it's inaccurate. I'd say it's accurate for the MMPI-2, but it's one point of data. And then we also have to look at the MMPI-3, and in the MMPI-3, there was no over or under reporting. So what you read in the MMPI-2 would imply that there was what's called positive impression management. There was an over reporting of virtuosity. But again, the MMPI-2 has its limitations because of it being dated, and there's other critique critiques of it.
I think I understand that. I'm just making sure that what you're saying here, what I read, that that's not inaccurate.
It's not inaccurate for the MMPI 2.
Okay. Well,
And that's
is it
my,
an inaccurate statement? Is that true?
it is true as far as the MMPI 2 presents. It's not universally true. I would say it was not universally true, but it is true as far as the MMPI 2. And at the time that I met her in 2019, I was still using the MMPI 2. Now,
No. Let me rephrase it.
sure.
I made a statement that was fairly easy, I think, to understand just from a lay person's perspective, right? Things like she's denying problems in an extreme manner, that she's consciously distorted the response to create this impression of an extreme moral and virtuous, and has no personal shortcomings. Those, just as a lay statement, is that true as it relates to your impression of Miss Brophy?
I'm struggling with it because of the apples and oranges pieces, meaning that her validity, as I wrote it, her validity scales show a mild self-favorable presentation. Those with this profile tend to do this.
Where does that say mild? I'm sorry.
So on page 8, under psychological testing, 1, 2, 3,
On page 8 of what? I'm sorry.
1, 2, 3, 4.
On page 8 of your report?
Yes,
Okay, but not of the actual interpretive report of the MMPI.
MMPI. Okay. Again, if you've got that, I'd be glad to see that because it depends on what the elevation is on her F scale.
If I have what? The MMPI too?
Yeah, do you have that?
You don't?
I didn't bring it this morning, no, thank you.
Show it to you? Yeah.
Please,
I'm gonna keep it in the binder so I don't get things mixed.
certainly understand that.
I obviously highlighted what I read to
Yeah.
you.
What I want to look at those.
That's what you wrote.
Okay,
And this-
here, let me. Okay, so if we look at these scales, right? Sorry, I know I need to be on the mic. So what we're looking at is the LFK. So L is a light, how virtuous somebody, and anything that goes over the 65 mark, which is this, then we're going to look at kind of the more extreme piece. But if it's over 60 and under 65, which her L is, it's at 62. Now we're talking really more mild. We're going to see elevations on K for people who are higher educated, who are more sophisticated, who have higher resources. The F scale is the it's kind of referring to what's historically been called the fake scale. And again, anything over, hers is 44, so it's not even in a range. So she's got what is called a V profile. If we took the F and put it over here, which is how, when I was in graduate school, how we were taught. So she's got the V profile, which would imply that there is this safe, favorable presentation. But the L scale is still in a mild range. It's not in an elevated range.
62, and you're not concerned about that till it hits a 65.
Well, that's why I put it in as mild. It's not significantly elevated until it's 65. And you expect to see elevations on the K scale, again, for people who may have higher resources, more higher levels of education, more sophisticated. It's a sophistication scale. So you're going to see that elevated there as well.
And as you noted in page 8 of your report, you use the term mild, but in your interpretive report, you actually don't say anything about it being mild.
And the interpretive report is done by the publisher. So that section that you showed me, it gets put into a program with Q Interactive, Q Global, Pearson, I believe. And then they kick out that kind of formulaic piece.
On the data, they form this, and then this page 8 that you referred to where you say mild, that's your interpretation of that interpretive data.
Yeah, and again, the problem with the MMPI 2 was it was based on a criterion keying, which again didn't catch on because it's not valid, but it gives us still information. And then the MMPI 2 had other criticisms of it, being normed in 1989, having a limited population in terms of diversity. And so often before, when I was just using the MMPI-2 and not the MMPI-3, I actually had a paragraph where I cautioned about using any one sentence because you need the whole, it's one point of data and you need the whole package.
And for a second, Mr. Overstreet, my understanding of what we're doing right now is really just assessing whether she's qualified to give certain opinions. You know, there'll be time for cross-examination, and maybe these questions are leading to that issue, but I'm not seeing how.
They are, and I'll sort
Okay.
of jump ahead here. So, and what I'm getting at is you're relying on this data when you're forming this opinion. Is that correct?
Yes, it's one point of data, yes.
1 point. And then you did the MMPI-3,
Yes.
and then you did the PAI.
No, I did the PAI with the MMPI-2. I believe I did those at the same time. Yeah, 6/15 of 19. So the MMPI-2 and the PAI were done at the same time. The MMPI-3 had come out, or I had begun using it. And so then when I saw in 2021, I gave her the MMPI-3.
Okay, I'm sorry, your dates don't really add up to me. You said that you gave her the evaluation on June 15th, 2019. What evaluation was that?
I met with her, we did history, we did some of the psychological testing. On 7/30, we did some more history, and then on 4/21, I met with her again and gave her, at that time, gave her the MMPI-3.
So when did you do the MMPI-2?
On 6/15 of 19.
When did you do the API?
PAI,
sorry,
6/15 of 19.
Okay, so what did you do on July 30th?
Gathered history.
Oh, okay, gotcha. Okay, so to get back to the question, you relied on this data and you relied on this collateral data. But the collateral data that you relied on involved, you talked about her friends and some of the things her friends had reported, but you didn't actually talk to any of those friends.
I did not.
You were reading defense investigator reports.
True.
In fact, you were reading defense investigator reports that were cherry-picked out of all of the defense investigator reports available.
Well, if
Did you know that?
well, I didn't know that they were cherry picked. I think I didn't. There was actually a lot more that I was given. I didn't.
I just want to focus on this part.
Sure.
We can talk about the rest. But you actually only got 12 of 31 defense investigator reports. Did you know that?
I reviewed 12 of the 31.
Were you given 31?
I was given more than I was reviewed. Yes.
Why didn't you review the others?
That's a really good question. You know, there were so many. There was so much documentation
Well, but
that I had to make limits.
the ones you seem to have picked seem to be very favorable to Miss Brophy. So how can you formulate an opinion, get the whole picture as you said, and just not read 19 other reports?
Sure. And if we're going to talk about statistically, then statistically, if I read, say, half of them, statistically, I should have found diversity within them, and I would have read more. However, there was such consistency.
Sorry, I did not mean to speak.
Sure.
They're defense investigator reports. Are you not expecting that they might be friendly to the defense?
Sure. Just like the police reports, I would suspect we would
What
be.
police reports did you read?
Oh dear, I didn't list them.
Because you didn't review them?
I did review them. We've got. I actually had two graduate students working with me, and we were going through because there were so many documents.
Where do you reference a police report in this entire report?
So on page 10, when Nancy Brophy's niece Susan Estrada was interviewed by police, that was a police report.
Okay, where's that?
Page 10, third paragraph.
Okay. What police report was that from?
It was an interview that was done on 3/13 of 19.
And that was a police report?
It was interviewed by police. Yes, she was.
record since you're sort of bending down away from the microphone.
sorry.
I can hear you, but I just want to make sure we're getting a decent record. Yeah.
So Susan Estrada was interviewed by police on 3/13 of 19.
Yeah.
There's a police report on page 21. And again, it was dated 6/2 of 18, the 911 call. Police report of videos from the time.
Okay, but that's about a 911 call, though. That's not about witnesses. Is that correct?
Yes, but the police report was reviewed.
But you don't have that in your list of collateral information that you reviewed.
Well, if I recall right, the Brophy family interview, the MP3 was done by the police officers.
Right. So I guess what I'm getting at is it's fair to say the only people that you heard from, other than defendant's friends and niece, Susan Estrada, was the Brophy family interview that was done by detectives with Jack and Karen Brophy.
Well, I did watch or I listened to and I don't remember if that's the 2000, the WS 20002, because I did listen to the police reports that were when Miss Brophy showed up at OCI, and then the officers, she has the officers drive her back to her house in her vehicle. I did listen to those recordings.
You listened to a recording where they discussed driving back to her house?
Man, I remember that. Hold on.
Well, I'm not trying to trick you.
Yeah, I know, I get that, and
Don't exist, so that's why.
yes. Well, there was, then it must have been the police reports, but I did read where, they were asking her they were surprised that she had, I was surprised, maybe that's a better way of saying it, was that, they wanted to go to her house to find the gun, and, she has them drive them to the house, and then there's police reports about what they're looking for at the house. And I did read the police reports of, and again, I don't know why it's not in here.
I want to narrow the questioning because I want
Sure.
to try to move on. But you had access to the police reports, it sounds like.
Yes.
Okay. So how come you didn't report on anyone else's, I believe 100 and something people involved in this case? You didn't include any of those when you're trying to determine this bigger picture of Nancy, specifically people that worked with her and knew her, specifically nobody that said anything bad about her. Is there a reason you didn't include that?
Yes. On page 3, just before data and findings. In my opinion, the information summarized above was sufficient for the purpose of this evaluation. I used this information obtained from my interview testing and aforementioned documents in the determination of my findings, because again, my report gets limited to what my referral questions are. But I've been only included information pertinent to the legal questions asked by Ms. Maxfield and Ms. Weinmiller in this report. As a forensic psychologist, I'm given a referral question. I could do a universal, but that's not what I was asked to do. It's just one piece of it.
Well, I'm going to move on, but I got to ask you this question. If you're saying to answer that first question about what kind of person she is, you said you need to know all of this stuff.
Sure.
It's your duty to know all of that stuff, and you had it available to you, but you just didn't use it.
I'm also prohibited from addressing the ultimate issue before the court. So you're right, there's a lot of stuff that I left out that would be going to that ultimate question. Because in that moment in time,
I don't, what do you mean? I don't.
I'm not a, I don't form an opinion in terms of the ultimate issue before the court. And most of that would be going to that piece. I was asked 3 referral questions, and I was addressing those 3 referral questions.
Okay, so I'm gonna move on to the third question then.
Okay.
You talked about memory, trauma, stuff like that. You provided 0 citations in your report. Is that correct?
That'd be correct.
You today, for the first time, the term dissociative disorder was brought up. That doesn't appear in your report, correct?
I believe I don't think dissociative disorder, I believe it was dissociative episodes came up.
Yeah, or dissociative amnesia, anything like that. Where does that appear in your report?
It isn't appearing in my report in that term, but when we talk about poor data being because of being flooded by adrenaline and then cortisol, which impedes memory, that is the core of the more technical term of dissociation.
Isn't there a DSM-5 definition of dissociation?
For dissociation, there is a dissociative identity disorder, but that is so incredibly rare and controversial. But the concept of dissociation is the idea of links in a chain of memory being unlinked or having gaps in those links. And that's not just in the DSM, that's a common understanding.
Okay, and so I guess I want to understand the scope of your testimony. That might help my questions. You're here to testify today about once somebody experiences this trauma, right? And in this case, vicarious trauma, correct?
No, actually, the DSM for Ptsd allows that if it happened to somebody that you know as being more, it wouldn't be vicarious, but it would be more of a direct.
Okay, so now we're talking about PTSD, so post-traumatic stress?
But we've got to remember that there are symptoms and there are syndromes. PTSD is a syndrome. You can still have symptoms and not have the syndrome. And so dissociation could be a symptom and the DSM-5 addresses syndromes.
Okay, but I'm trying to focus on what the scope of the testimony is to see what your qualifications are.
Okay.
Because are you testifying today about Ms. Brophy's reaction to that traumatic moment where she's notified of her husband's death and what happened to her moving forward and how she would react?
Well, also in terms of memory, in terms of what happens to the memory when one is informed of a traumatic event.
Right, the memory after the traumatic event.
Sure, but again, memory can be impeded retroactively.
Okay, so that's what I'm going to get at. That's the scope of your testimony today is you're also going to testify that the memory is impeded retroactively.
It can be, especially if it's not, if it's redirected, if it is not programmed, allowed, given time to formulate into long-term memory.
Okay, and so what studies do you have? You didn't cite any. What studies are you relying on to be able for you to talk today as an expert about retrograde amnesia?
Well, again, the work on Elizabeth Loftus is good for memories that are perhaps not accurate. When we talk about Bessel van der Kolk's work on...
Let's talk about Loftus first.
Okay.
Doesn't Loftus focus on children?
She did, but there is also some crossover into, say, false memories. So, for example...
Well, hang on. Not false memories. Retrograde amnesia. You have no memory of a specific event.
Sure.
We'll get to false memory in a minute, but talking about retrograde amnesia, no memory of prior to a traumatic event.
Sure. And so probably more the work of, again, Bessel van der Kolk out of Boston, John Briere out of UCLA.
Hold on. You're just throwing out names. What are these studies and what are you reading?
Okay,
What is the basis
so-
of your expertise?
Sure. And so Bessel van der Kolk looked at trauma and how it affects then regulation and emotional regulation and the neural processes. So if I may, for example, if somebody in this room has had histories of severe trauma and PTSD, and if I were to suddenly, unexpectedly pound on this table, it would kind of shock and disorient them. So for those of us that don't have that piece, it's not we're just going to take a moment to kind of look at what happened and then we go on. But the dysregulation that happens for people who have trauma is going to last for longer periods of time than it is for somebody who's not. Again, a lot of the work with, as you mentioned, with children found that memories can be, if you're not, see, and the reason I'm struggling too is that the research on memory goes back to the 60s and 70s, where that we had aspects of understanding memory and learning, and that is the disruption. So it's kind of commonly accepted. And so you're right. It's difficult to do the more. We can talk in generalities of whose research we're looking at. Someone newer would be Antonio Damasio, who has looked at that the way that the body is reacting to a trauma piece, and that we have his research on the neurobiology has shown that instead of kind of going again from the top down to the body goes up. And so the memories are visceral. There's lots of research, and I can't give you names, but because memories, as we tend to think of memories as visual pieces, so this came out of the work with children, is that if you go to raise your hand to strike a child, they're going to close their eyes. They're not going to have a visual memory. And so you're asking for a visual memory when there is none because it wasn't encoded. But the idea of encoding has gone back for
All right,
decades.
Dr. Warford, I'm going to interrupt you for a minute, and I'm going to try to focus us all. I am convinced, and the state doesn't object, that Dr. Warford is qualified to speak about domestic violence relationships and whether or not the Brophies were in one. I'm also convinced that Dr. Warford has the requisite expertise to speak about trauma and how it impacts, generally people's memories and presentations. I thought the question was, how would the trauma impact her memory or presentation? I haven't really heard anything about that, and I'm not sure it would be appropriate, but at least to the extent that she's going to speak about trauma and neural pathways and how it can impact memory and presentation, I have no issue with such testimony. The first question the state raised, I still haven't even heard what her answer is to it. After nearly 45 minutes of this hearing, the question was, how would the trauma, what are her qualifications to comment on what type of person Ms. Brophy is? I don't know what her answer to that question is. And yet I'm going to be asked to evaluate whether she has the expertise to speak to it. So I'm just going to ask you directly, Dr. Warford, since I haven't read any of the reports, what's your answer to the question of what type of person Ms. Brophy is?
And I will admit, I don't like the way that is worded. I think a better way of wording it is what are her traits, and how does her personality manifest?
Okay. All right. Okay. I think that makes more sense to me. So getting to the one question, what are her personality traits? And what was the second part of it that you said?
And how do they manifest?
And how do they manifest? Does the state want to ask any questions regarding her level of training or expertise to speak to that question, or to hear what her answer would be to that question?
No, Your Honor, I think more of the objection is that what she based it on isn't complete and valid, which she is saying is needed. So I don't think I need to ask any more questions to further the
Okay,
objection.
all right. I will allow her then to address these issues. I think you've got plenty if you want to cross-examine her on, but I don't see that she's unqualified to provide this testimony. So let's take our morning break. Let's plan to start back up at 11 o'clock. Thanks for your patience. It's unavoidable. I think we are ready for the defense next witness, who was not on the stand at the time the jury left. So can defense call its next witness?
Yes, Your Honor. The defense calls Dr. Patty Warford.
All right, and Ms. Warford, or sorry, Dr. Warford has already been sworn, so we don't need to do that again. But what we will do, Dr. Warford, is for the jury, have you restate your name and spell it if you could.
Patricia Warford. Patricia, Patricia, Warford, Warf as in Frank, ORD.
All right, and then whenever you're ready, Ms. Weinmiller.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Warford, what is your profession?
I'm a licensed psychologist.
Right. When were you initially licensed?
I was licensed in Oregon in 1998.
Had you been licensed as a psychologist before that?
Not before that.
Okay. And where did you go to school?
George Fox University. It was college at the time, but now it's university.
Well, let's talk about all of your degrees. You need more than one.
I started out of high school at University of Nebraska Medical Center many years ago, and then I finished my, kind of bounced around, I finished my bachelor's degree in psychology at University of South Dakota in Brookings, South Dakota.
I'm sorry, that was a little quick. Can you slow down?
Yeah, I finished my undergrad work at University of South Dakota, or rather South Dakota State University in Brookings, South Dakota. I did my master's level at George Fox College, now university. I completed my master's there, and then I completed my doctorate there in 1998.
All right. And what did you do after you graduated? And I assume you had some relevant experience probably while you were in school. So why don't you start at the point at which you were working in the profession, in this field?
As I said, I started in graduate school in 1991. We started doing practicum in 1992. My first practicum was at a college university, working with college students. In 1993, I started working with sexually abused children at Yamhill County Mental Health Family and Youth. And then I went to work part-time for Yamhill County Mental Health Adult Programs. I started my internship at Western Psychological Association in 1994. As I said, completed my doctorate in 1996. I finished my residency at Western Psychological and then was licensed in 1998. In 1999, part of 98, I went back to Yamhill County for about 2 years. And then in 1999, I started part-time in private practice and then completed full-time private practice starting in about 2000 and did clinical therapy work as a therapist until November of 2019. My first,
So during that period, that sounds like that was about 20 years, you were in private practice?
yes,
Were you in the Yamhill County area?
I was originally I was out by Gresham, 148th and Sandy, and then I moved to Newburgh around 2003, I think.
Okay, so maybe half.
Yeah, just, I mean, it was
first
really
quarter.
early, it was a couple of years.
Okay, so when you say clinical practice, what does that mean?
It means doing therapy with children, adolescents, and adults, individual. I didn't do much family work. I did couples work. I did group work.
All right, so a fairly general practice.
Yes.
All right. At some point, did you develop well, let me back up. During the period that you were being educated and going through all of those many practicums and internships, sounds like quite a bit of that work was for the state, was for the government. Is that true?
Well, it was community mental health.
Right.
Yes.
Right, you were employed by the government, or funded essentially by the government. Was most of that work in the context of abuse and trauma, really problematic cases that had attracted some sort of governmental involvement?
Often, but not universally.
Okay. And then in private practice, it sounds like perhaps you were working with a somewhat more diverse group, cross-section of the community?
I would say so, and also a more group that had more resources. Typically, they had insurance, although I did take Oregon Health Plan.
Okay. At some point, did your focus start to narrow to abuse cases in particular again?
Well, again, I started in '93 with sexually abused children
Right, I mean in private practice.
in
I'm
private
asking
practice.
about
It
your
stayed,
practice.
from '93 pretty much all the way through because my doctoral dissertation was on domestic violence, but again, trauma and recovery was my area of expertise.
So how did that play out in your clinical practice?
Well, I got a lot of referrals that were at times more focused towards domestic violence victims. But because it was also generic in terms of trauma and recovery, I did more diverse groups such as, say, people who had been assaulted. I had worked with police officers, including officers who had been traumatized by being in police officer shootings. I've worked with jury members who had had to sit through hellacious trials, and so any kind of trauma and recovery.
Okay, and is it fair to say that you developed a reputation for having a specialization with respect to trauma and recovery?
I think that's fair.
Okay. At some point, did your focus then migrate further into doing some forensic work?
In my first time testifying was in 1990, spring of '94. I was a graduate student, and my testimony was as a therapist. And then in 1998, after I was licensed, my first testimony in person was as a prosecution witness on a domestic violence case.
And how many times do you think you've testified over the course of your career?
I've done over 500 reports. I think I've testified about 45 times, between 40 and 45 times.
Okay. Is it largely in criminal cases or juvenile?
Largely, mainly criminal, some DHS cases.
Okay. And you've testified on both sides of the aisle?
Yes.
Okay. And you're willing to do that?
Oh, certainly.
Do you think that your assessments vary depending on who hires you?
No, because it's the data.
All right. Now, are you at this point still engaged in a clinical practice or are you doing just forensic work?
In November of 2019 was the last time I did clinical work, and I'm moving towards retirement, so I wanted to cut back and just do forensic work.
Because coming to court is easy.
No.
Um, before we move on to talking about this case and what you were asked to do in this case, can you talk just a little bit more about some of the positions that you've held in professional associations or boards or different like task forces that have been convened?
So I was on the Governor's Council for Domestic Violence, but it disbanded. I'm currently on the Oregon Domestic Violence Fatality Review Team.
Can you speak up just a little bit? I'm
Yeah.
having a hard time hearing some of that. Maybe it's just the pace.
Sure. I was on the Oregon Governor's Council for Domestic Violence. I'm currently on the Oregon Domestic Violence Fatality Review Team, which has started in 2012. Officially, I am certified as a Oregon Certified Forensic Evaluator, which began again in 2012. I am on the board for ADVIP, which is the Association of Domestic Violence IP intervention programs, I believe, or providers. I am a member of AAFP, which is the American Association of Forensic Psychologists. As I said, I'm licensed in Oregon. I was licensed in Washington for a period of time, but I got too busy in Oregon, and so I let that lapse. When I lived in Yamhill County, I was on their domestic violence task force for years. I think that's it.
Okay, that's good. So in this, when were you first contacted by Ms. Brophy's defense team? How long have you been working on this particular matter?
Oh, well, I first met Ms. Brophy in June of 2019, so it would have been before that. I can't give you an exact date.
In that time frame, though, at least since 2019?
Yes.
Okay. And how many hours would you say you've invested overall working on this case? Just roughly, it doesn't have to be exact.
At this point, probably about 50.
Okay.
10 of it was actually, 10 and a half was actually interviewing and testing Ms. Brophy, but then there's lots of collateral documents and writing reports, those sorts of things.
Okay, but somewhere in the vicinity of 50 hours, you think?
I think so.
Were you asked to perform an evaluation specific uh, to Ms. Brophy and some of the pertinent facts in this case?
Yes.
What were the referral questions that you were given? What specifically were you asked to evaluate?
There were three. In the light of available data, interview, testing, collateral documents, how would you describe Ms. Brophy, Ms. Crampton Brophy? The second one is, did Dan and Nancy Brophy experience a domestically violent relationship? On what do you base your opinion? And then three, given your opinion on the above, how would trauma impact Ms. Crampton Brophy, her memory and her presentation?
All right. So let's break that down. Now, first of all, let's talk more generally. You indicated that you've spent, you think, probably about 10 hours in direct interviews with Ms. Crampton Brophy.
Yes.
I'm going to shorten that to Brophy because it's easier for me, but you can choose either formulation. So those 10 hours, is that stretched over the time period that you've described since 2019?
It was three different occasions.
Okay. And was the longest of those periods in 2019?
Yes.
Why is it important to talk directly with the person that you're evaluating?
Primarily because we have an ethics code. And in our ethics code 9.01, it requires that if I have not directly evaluated the individual, I am obligated to tell you, the hearer, that what I have to say may not be valid or, reliable or valid. And so it is an important aspect of any assessment.
And that is so widely recognized within the profession that that's actually codified as an ethical requirement.
It's written in our ethics code, yes.
Did you also conduct some testing?
I did.
We'll come back to that in just a moment, talk a little bit more about that. But when performing this type of evaluation, is there a third source of data that you look to as well?
Collateral documents, which I believe the legal profession refers to as discovery.
And did you, in fact, look at all three of those phases of information in order to reach your assessments?
I did.
Let's talk for a moment about, we'll come back to the psychological test, but let's talk about the collateral documents that you reviewed. I realize that you don't have your billing records in front of you, but what's your best estimate of how much time you spent looking at and reviewing collateral sources?
Oh, man. Probably 30 hours at least. And the reason I hesitate is as I'm writing the report, sometimes I have to go back. And so sometimes it gets put in as write-up and sometimes it gets put in as document review, but at least 30 or more hours. And then early in the process, I had a graduate student who also reviewed documents and then made a summary and let me know what was redundant and what I didn't.
Okay, so you had a team, at least a team of two, and part of the collateral review was performed by this associate that was working with you?
Yeah, but again, it was just an outline to tell me what was redundant, so I didn't have to double look at things.
Oh, okay, all right. You have in the report, you did generate an evaluation report.
Yes,
Would you look at page 3 of that report with me?
yes,
You've got a long list there. It takes up more than half the page of the sources of information that you reviewed. And I don't want to go through each and every one of them. But you've got 28 items listed here. And I'd like to talk with you about which of those were provided. Well, all of this material was provided to you by the defense team. Is that correct?
yes.
Was it apparent to you that many of the items that were provided to you were what we call in the profession discovery, material that had come to us from the state, from the prosecution side?
Yes,
Did you personally review an interview that was conducted by the detectives of Dan Brophy's parents and his son?
yes, that was on an MP3.
Okay. Did you review some materials that related to the genesis of the reports, the discovery of his death, and the initial reports that went out?
Yes,
Did you review the interactions, all of the interactions that Ms. Brophy had with the police over the summer of 2018?
Yes,
And did that consist of the initial interview that was done on June 2nd when she went down to the Culinary Institute, was interviewed by police?
yes.
Did you have both an audio and a transcript of that to refer to?
I believe I did. The reason I say is that there's a reference up top that is a audio that to be quite honest, I don't remember what that was, but it seems like I remember it. And the docs document obviously would be a written document.
Okay, and I'd like to direct your attention down to what you have here as items 13 and 14. It's referred to as a death notification audio.
Yes,
And 13 is the audio and 14 is the transcript.
yes,
Okay. Do you recognize that now as an interview of Ms. Brophy by police on June 2nd when they were notifying her of the death?
yes.
And then there's also another set of interviews above that. It's got kind of a generic title. Do you remember now exactly what those were, the Nancy Brophy interviews?
I believe those were again of her initial contacts.
Okay, and then there's also one, you've got it listed as item 5, a phone call, Brophy phone call.
Yes,
Was that a call between Ms. Brophy and Detective Posey?
yes,
And that was a few days after her husband's murder?
yes.
Did you understand that there were any other conversations that occurred between Ms. Brophy and the detectives?
Not that I recall now.
Okay. Now, you've also got down here a couple of interviews. It looks like both audio files, interviews with Mr. Brophy's son, Nathaniel.
Yes,
You reviewed those as well?
yes,
And then there's a report of an interview with a man named Brett Glendenning, who is the individual who sold Ms. Brophy the gun at the Expo Center gun show. Do you recall reviewing that?
yes,
Okay. Then further down the list, there are a whole series of interviews that were done with people who knew Ms. Brophy and were close to her over a period of time, and most of whom had had contact with her in the immediate aftermath or in the immediate vicinity of June 2nd, the date of her husband's death. Do you recall reviewing those reports?
yes.
Were you also given 2 other written materials that were generated during the course of the Brophy marriage?
Yes.
What were those?
One was a letter to Dan Brophy from Ms. Brophy because she was going into surgery, and it was in case she died in surgery, what things he would have to be aware of, who he needed to contact, how he would get access to health insurance, what kind of chain to set up, call Aunt so-and-so, and she'll call all these other people. And so that was the letter that it gets referred to as the Dearest Dan letter. And then another one was a series of texts between 2000, I want to say 16 and 18. It was 234 pages of texts between Dan and Nancy Brophy.
Okay. And that the last text thread that you're referring to, was that essentially an unbroken series of exchanges between the 2 of them, their entire text thread over that 3-year period?
As far as I know.
Okay. And you said it was about 234 pages
Yeah,
worth of text?
yeah, the pages of text, not number of texts, but pages of text, yes.
Okay. All right. Let's go back to what you had mentioned second, the tests that you conducted. Now, why in your profession are standardized tests given to people who are subjects of an evaluation?
I think there's 2 main reasons. One is that the tests, we can get data from it. With the MMPI 2 was over 500 questions, and so we
Well,
can get,
let's hang on just a second.
General.
I'm asking you a very general question about standardized tests, why they're considered valuable in your profession.
they give us succinct data
Okay.
about the individual.
And why is it helpful to know how an individual compares to the general population?
Well, not all of the tests compare to the general population, and the MMPI 2 did, but it is important to know, again, in terms of generalities. However, with the MMPI-3 and the PAI, they weren't actuarial.
We're going to talk about what the specific tests are, but I want you just to give a comprehensive answer to why those kinds of tests are performed in an evaluation. And then we can talk about which you choose to perform in any given evaluation.
Okay. It gives us a framework for understanding personality traits, psychological symptoms, and syndromes.
Okay, so which of those tests did you decide to utilize in this particular evaluation?
Initially, I did the the MMPI-2 and which is Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, second edition, and the Personality Assessment Inventory.
Okay, now, it might help if you just pulled this in just a little bit. I know you're recovering from an illness. Tell us what the MMPI-2 did, and then we can talk about why you chose to also perform the MMPI-3.
The MMPI-2 was developed in 1989. It was, again, a predominantly white population. It was based on the MMPI, the original MMPI, which was done in Minnesota. It looked at actuarial data, meaning how did most people answer these questions. It was also had subscales that were theoretically thought to produce good data. Subsequent research did not support that. And so it was revised with the MMPI-2RF, restructured form, and then eventually replaced by the MMPI-3, the third edition.
Okay. What are the differences between the MMPI-2 and the MMPI-3? First of all, are you required to now migrate to the MMPI-3, or do you have the option of relying on either of those?
Yeah, I'd say it's the option because there's still some controversies. There's still some, and I was initially that way too, is that we were trained on the MMPI-2, so there was some resistance to move to the 3. But when I reviewed the data that was, the research that was done for the MMPI-3, then I made the transition. So the MMPI-2 had subtle and obvious scales, which again, subsequent research showed didn't support. It's kind of complicated. There's a thing called criterion keying, which was what the theory behind the MMPI, original MMPI. It didn't have good research. The MMPI-2 required a 8th grade reading level with some questions being at the 11th grade. The MMPI-3 got away from the subtle obvious scales, and it also simplified the language to a 4th grade reading level.
Okay, so is the MMPI, whether you're administering the 2 or the 3, is that sort of the standard starting point for most psychological evaluations?
For the testing aspect of it, yes.
I'm sorry, I'm talking about just the testing component. Would it be relatively unusual to see a psychological evaluation that didn't start with MMPI?
For most of us, yes. There's a Mark Cunningham out of Seattle, and he advocates not using standardized tests.
Okay, but is he an outlier so far?
But he's also very well known and respected within the field.
Sure, okay. All right, what other testing did you perform?
I scored what is called the Hare Psychopathy Checklist.
There's one more that you mentioned that
Oh, the Personality Assessment Inventory?
Is that the PAI you
That's the
mentioned earlier?
PAI.
Okay, and I think what you said earlier is that at the time that you administered the MMPI-2, you also administered the PAI test. So tell us about that.
The PAI, so the Personality Assessment Inventory was where the MMPI was developed with criterion keying. The PAI developer went and looked at what are the traits of, say, depression or anxiety or aggression. And then he put those questions into the PAI. And so it is based on a literature review.
Okay, is that also considered a standardized test?
It is. And the reason I do both is to look for consistency between the two.
To look for what?
Consistency.
Between the MMPI and the PAI? It's kind of a test to make sure that you're getting good results?
Yes.
Okay. Now, do you score the MMPI yourself with either the 2 or the 3? I'm assuming the answer would be the same for both, but if not, you can tell me.
The answer is I don't hand score it.
How does that work? You administer it, you or your assistant go in and meet with Ms. Brophy and you have her fill that out, and then what do you do with it?
If it is done on, we can either give it on paper or we can give it electronically. It goes to, if it's on paper, then we key it in to Pearson and they spit out a overview of the results, a profile. If it's done on an electronic iPad, for example, then they immediately spit it out and we can see the results. For both the MMPIs and the PAI, it's scored
But
electronically.
I'm asking you right now just about the MMPI.
It's scored via Pearson, which is a testing company.
Okay, so when you say it spits out the results, somebody else is interpreting the results or some other entity is interpreting the results.
Well, with the original MMPI-2, again, it was based on actuarial data. And so the problem with that is that it would go with the most common response, even if, say, 100 people. The reason why it matters is because you could have an actuarial could be only 20% of the population, but it has the one that had the highest. And so with the MMPI-3, they moved away from that to look at just what was worded in there.
Okay, I think I'm asking you a more basic question, not what the scoring represents, but how it's actually scored. You administer this, you have an assistant or somebody gives Ms. Brophy the test or any other client that you're evaluating, they get the test, and then what happens to the actual test that's been filled out? Is that sent to an entity in Minnesota or how is that?
I go online and I have access to the scoring protocols there and I key it in.
Okay,
I key in the answers.
okay. And then is the test response then given back to you by the computer?
Yes,
When you're given those results, do they come with a set of interpretive guides?
they do.
What are those referred to?
Again, the actuarial data. How do most people answer this?
No.
Oh,
What is the interpretive guide itself? What's that called? What comes back
the
with
protocol,
the test?
the validity or the clinical protocol profiles.
Okay, is it profile validity or what's the term for it?
So the first 3 scales are what are called, in the MMPI, are called validity scales. The original in the MMPI. Then there's other validity scales that look at how does a person answer. Are they being self-favorable? Are they being self-denigrating? Or is it a valid profile? Those are the validity scales that come out. And then it gives you a clinical profile.
Okay, so the report that you get back gives you the score, and then it gives you this guide that you use in interpreting the scores that it's reported to you?
Yes,
Is that correct?
Yes, with a caution that because it's based on actuarial data, it may need to be tweaked using professional judgment for the individual.
Okay, so and that's where the actual data comes in, is what it's telling you, as I understand it, when you get this report back, what they're saying to you is essentially, here are some things you may want to look at. Here are the scores, and then here is our key to things that you may want to further evaluate based on these scores.
Yes.
Okay. And is that true both for the MMPI 2 and the 3?
And I would say even more with the 3. The 3 is the result of having more research. And the 2 had some more theoretical imposition onto it.
Okay, so at this point in the process, you've got the data that Ms. Brophy enters into the test, and then you've got the report that comes back to you from the organization, right, that's essentially being generated by the computer. At this point, have you actually typed in or done anything yourself other than just oversee the process?
At this point, no.
Yes, okay. So that report that's coming back from the company, is it a nonprofit?
No.
Is it?
It is a testing corporation.
Okay, so the report that's coming back from the MMPI testing corporation, is
Pearson.
not a report into which you've had any direct input at that point.
Correct.
Okay, so you take the test, and in this point, in this instance, you're getting the result back from two different companies then, right?
Correct.
Is the PAI scored in a similar way where she takes the test and then the company says that here are the results, here's the computer-generated report that we're gonna provide to you of the result of her test?
Correct.
Okay. Well, does that one also come with sort of a key or a guide that gives you some input about different scores and what their potential significance are?
Yes.
All right, so you had both of those back, I assume sometime in this, if you administered it in June, sometime in the summer of 2019?
Oh, probably within days of when it was administered.
Okay, and then when did you give her the MMPI 3?
I believe that was in 2001,
You mean 21?
2021. Sorry, yes, 2021.
Okay. All right, and were you able to rely upon or find useful information in all three of those tests in forming your evaluation?
Always, yes.
Um, uh, What did you find as a result of this evaluation in response to that first question that was posed to you? What traits did you find Ms. Brophy possesses, and how did they manifest? What did you find about how those traits manifest in her?
She tends to be very independent. She tends to be a problem-solving, cognitive.
Can you speak up just a little bit more?
Sure. She tends to be independent. She tends to be fairly forthright. She's going to tell you directly. She tends to be cognitive. She's a thinker. She's not somebody who is going to be overly emotional. And there's another component that needs to play in here that I don't know that we've mentioned, which is one's history also is very important. So a woman in her 60s is going to have different reactions because she's had different life experience than a woman, say, in her 20s. And so you have to consider that. The place, the area a person was raised is going to have a different implication. So for Ms. Brophy, she tends to have long-term relationships, long-term friendships. They tend to be deep and abiding. She's not someone who tends to have. She has lots of friends, but she doesn't tend to have lots of superficial friends. These are people who've had experiences with her and have deep conversations with her. She has no history of mental illnesses. She has no history of substance use that has been detrimental or difficulties relating to it.
And is this, you had talked initially about the interview portion, and then you'd spent about 10 hours with her. Are you gathering most of that from the interview or from collateral sources, or are you now, at this point, blending all of that together?
At this point, it's blending it all together.
Okay, so you're not relying just on what she told you, but you're making an effort to really corroborate and substantiate that information?
Well, I'm taking what she told me, looking at her test scores, looking at the interviews and then blending that together for these more long-term traits.
Okay, all right, were there more? I stopped you just because I wanted to clarify that point, but you might have been in the middle of describing these relevant traits.
She values independence and interdependence. She verbally processes. So she is someone who, on certain areas, is going to talk her way through it. And it's not that she's talking her way through it to you, it's that she's processing it, and she's processing it out loud. And then when it comes to her more creative endeavors in terms of writing, and this was, again, based on Friend's piece, she will tend to kind of work it all out in her head. And her friends mentioned about kind of being, my term, spaced out, and she's just working out, but it's problem solving.
Okay. And I know you didn't administer a standard IQ test, but in terms of traits, could you describe just generally sort of her cognitive functioning and her cognitive ability relative to other people in her demographic group?
So part of what we do is what's called a behavior observations or a mental status exam. And we do ask questions that go for different areas that would be on an IQ test. I didn't administer an IQ test because she's college educated. She's a writer. She's going to have probably more verbal skills just based on that. But based on her vocabulary, based on her mental status exam, I would think that she has a high average, above average to high intellectual functioning level.
Okay. So through this, let me ask you a couple of questions then about your evaluation and your sense of the Brophy relationship, and specifically whether it constituted a domestically violent relationship. And I think probably the best starting point would be just to talk professionally, not in the context of their relationship, but more generally. Is there an understanding in the profession? Is there essentially a definition for when a relationship is considered domestically violent?
Yes. So this was a 1996 Department of Justice, National Institute of Justice, U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and National Institute of Mental Health definition for domestic violence. It is a pattern of coercive control characterized by the use of physical, sexual, or psychologically abusive behaviors used by one person to control and subordinate another in an intimate relationship. The behaviors include physical, sexual, psychological, and economic abuse. Tactics of coercion, terrorism, degradation, exploitation, violence are used to engender fear and in order to enforce compliance.
So it sounds like that definition is comprehensive enough to include a lot of emotional or psychological abuse, that it doesn't require a finding of physical violence. Is that correct?
That would be true. The research shows that less than 6% of violence in a domestically violent relationship is physical. The vast majority is psychological, verbal.
Okay. Is it true, though, that the definition anticipates or requires that at some point there be an act of actual physical violence?
No, actually, this definition, there's another portion under it, which says that if a former partner had used physical abuse and the current partner refers to that as a kind of intimidation, psychologically inducive, there doesn't have to be physical in this relationship. So if a former partner is physically abusive and the current partner says, you know what, I get why they hit you, right? You don't have to have physical in this one, because the use of intimidation, fear in the prior one is enough to inspire fear and for conformance.
In the example that you gave, that's a threat of physical violence, right?
Yes.
Okay, so the term intimidation, is that essentially synonymous with threatening to invoke physical violence? I'm right on the verge of physical violence.
Sure. And again, if we think of domestic violence, I think of it as a triangle, with the most common being psychological, the next being verbal. And so verbal includes things like threats, comments that are intimidating, those sorts of things. Then the next level is, verbal power, property, breaking things, throwing things. The next is sexual, and then the top is physical.
Okay, so how does an argumentative nature or an argumentative relationship play into that?
Well, you can be argumentative and not have a domestically violent relationship.
Okay.
So you can actually have a healthy relationship and be argumentative. It depends on how the argument is done, not the what of the argument. Well, there's aspects of what as well, but when you look at, is there an equity in there? Is this kind of a going back and forth? So John Gottman uses examples of, say, Italians. I was born in Italy, so I kind of feel safer using that group. You know, we can use our hands and we might be more expressive. And you would see that population being more maybe verbal, but not necessarily abusive. It doesn't necessarily automatically make it that.
Okay, so you can argue without ever being threatening. I
Sure.
think is what you're saying. Okay, but it would be that element of threat in an argument that then kind of took it into the realm of the potential value of a domestic violence evaluation.
Sure. And you would tend to see things like contempt, criticism. Those are the ones that tend to be more active.
So how do you go about assessing whether a relationship is domestically violent in practice? I understand what you're saying from an academic perspective, sort of what the contours would be, but how would you actually apply that?
Again, for me, I did my doctoral dissertation in 96 to 90 on domestic violence. So there's aspects of the interview that I look at. I'd mentioned before the term contempt. And again, the research by John Gottman found that contempt was the most likely to lead to a shorter relationship. So is there condescending? Is there a demonizing of the other? Those are ways that you would look at it psychologically. More commonly, because domestic violence is hidden, what is very helpful is if we can have text messages are helpful. And the reason for that is that nobody thinks, you know what, somebody's going to read all these text messages. Somebody who has just seen them briefly is not so helpful because you can cover during those brief periods. Somebody who's lived with them for a lengthy period of time, that would be more helpful, because when somebody holds somebody else in contempt or has a contemptuous attitude, you pick it up, you get it, you hear it. So those collateral documents, data is important.
So in that instance, if I'm following what you're saying, you would be interested in a person's self-report, but what would be particularly valuable would be the perspectives of either of collateral sources, and that I presume would most often be people, but it could be other sources of information that would show you in a temporal sense what the true nature of the relationship was over time.
Yes.
Did you, in this case, have access to information that gave you that sort of temporal look at the relationship over time?
Well, as I said, I had the 234 pages of text messages. And then Susan Estrada had lived with them for a period of time. And she also had her observations.
All right. And what did you learn from reviewing that material, both Susan Estrada's report and also those text threads, or the text exchanges between the two of them over that couple-year period?
Well, Ms. Estrada, said that there was a relationship that she had admired. May I give what is like typical? Typical, you'll hear, they've got this really good relationship, but. So, there's this one time, and when you don't have that, especially if somebody has lived with them, that's important. The text messages.
And are you saying that in fact that was Ms. Estrada's report?
No, Mr. Estrada's report did not have the but.
Okay.
Did not have the exception. The text messages are important because they are a running commentary. Are they complete? No. But they can often help us see things like contempt, name calling. If I may, there was another case I worked on, had I think 20 pages of text messages, and it was very common in those pages to see the person who was abusive call the other person vulgar names, make accusations of affairs, make threats, and so it's to have a lengthy period of time, and that was in 20 pages. I think it was 20. But in this, I had 234 pages that, frankly, with one possible exception, was pretty mundane. Hey, I'm going to go have lunch with so-and-so. Okay, I won't worry about dinner for you. And this went both ways. And so there was nowhere in there that I could find contempt or criticism. There was absolutely, and again, imagine if I looked at 234 pages of anybody's text messages, and there was absolutely none. You just can't see it. The one possible exception was there was one that said, it was in bold print, Dan, you left the car unlocked again. You know I leave papers in there. That one text out of 234 is the only thing that's possible. Could be a criticism, could be what Gottman calls a complaint, which is a healthy way of addressing conflict within a relationship. So it is unusual. I mean, it's almost impossible, I think, to have 2 years of text messages and not have something in there that would allow us to see contempt or disgruntled or, again, nothing.
Okay, and this particular exchange had to do with Ms. Brophy apparently finding her car had been left unlocked with some valuable things inside of it?
Apparently, and again, it was a one and done kind of thing.
Okay, now, you described the continuity of this thread in a couple different ways, and I just want to be clear with you. You'd said just now that it was 234 texts, but earlier you
No,
said
I'm
it
sorry.
was 234 pages of text.
Yeah, no, it was 234 pages of text from 4/15/2016 to 6/2/2018.
So, a little bit over 2 years.
Yes.
Correct, okay. And did they text then with some regularity? Were they texters, or would you describe them as people who were infrequently communicating that way?
I think they're kind of moderate, and then there appeared to be times when there might be too much text and one or the other would say, call me, and then we don't know what went from there. But for the most part, they're mundane. They're everyday life things.
And did you see evidence of humor in the relationship in those texts?
I did.
Did you see evidence of fondness?
I did.
Did you see occasional references even to their still having an active sexual life?
I did.
I won't ask you to detail that, but how prevalent were those kinds of exchanges that might have been mundane, but they were on the positive, affirming side?
They were common. I would still say the mundane was the predominant grouping, but there was an ongoing, obvious inside joke between the two of them. And both of them made a reference to it. It's not like only Dan made references to it. There were times that Nancy also, and it was obvious some sort of running inside joke for the two of them.
Okay. And even with respect to the ones that were a little bit more on the mundane side, was there evidence there of collaboration and working together to accomplish objectives and just kind of staying in touch with each other? I mean, were they mundane to the point of being pointless, or could you see that there was an active, purposeful exchange of communication in those messages?
I would say most were purposeful. What would you like for dinner? A lot of them had to do with food. What would you like to do for dinner? I was thinking about this. Oh, that sounds marvelous. Don't forget so-and-so's coming over. Don't forget we've got this. And so it was that kind of just things that couples do to stay in touch, to remind each other, to inform each other of what's going on, individually. And again, it went both ways. So there were times that he had met somebody for lunch or for dinner, and so he wasn't going to be home. Or there's times she met somebody and she wasn't going to be home. So.
Okay. And I'm going to refer you back now again to the collateral sources too, and the material that you reviewed that came from the discovery that was produced as part of the police investigation in this case. Were there any materials that you reviewed that provided you with some evidence of domestic violence in the relationship?
None. There weren't any police reports, but that again is not uncommon.
Well, I'm talking about though, whether you were given an audio of an interview or whether you were given a transcript of the audio interview, it's the same piece of information that came from the police interview. Mm-hmm. So I'm not really asking you to distinguish between whether you listened to it or whether you read it.
Not as I recall. That there's nothing to imply domestic violence.
Okay, well, when you say not as I recall, since this is your training and your experience and your area of expertise, would you expect that you would recall if you'd seen something of that nature?
Yeah,
or heard something, sorry.
Sure, there's one that, it quite honestly, it's questionable, and I didn't go back and review it, and that may be something related to Nathaniel's interview, but again, it was mundane. It was not, there was no There is nothing in the documents to imply that one or the other of them were afraid of the other one, that there was any kind of fear, that there was any kind of coercive behaviors between the two of them.
Okay. Now, if one partner has a nickname for the other, something like management, does that cause you to kind of look into what that nickname means, what the significance of that is?
Of course.
Okay. Well, how did you interpret that, or how did that fit into your evaluation here? Was that an indication that she was somehow controlling him, or did you ultimately come away with a different impression of the significance of that nickname?
Well, initially, I always approach it as that it can be anything. So initially, it could be control. It could be a joke about being controlling. The other piece is that, again, within John Gottman's work, is that it could be what is called open to the influence of the other. And Gottman found that in healthy relationships, there's 5 main traits, but only one does he gender, and that is being open to your partner's influence. And in that, he found that in healthy relationships, in healthy heterosexual relationships, the man was open to the woman's influence. So if it seemed to become as a term of fondness, especially in light of all of the other the text messages. There's nothing in the text messages to imply that there is, fear or concern that the other person's going to be mad or those sorts of things. So
What about resentment?
no, I couldn't find it.
Let me go ahead and stop you there. We're at just about noon. So we'll take our afternoon break and let's plan to resume promptly at 1:30.